Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our Econ Show. On the Econ Show, we're going to look at things that are happening on a global view, and we're really going to focus a bit more on Q4 across the different segments. So in segment one, we want to look at how are things shaping up globally when you were looking at food, geopolitics, macro in terms of trade. In segment two, we want to look at, okay, how, we'll talk through Q3 GDP within the US, and then how does Q4 unfold based on some of this information. And then that's going to continue into segment three, where we're going to take leading economic indicators and is that looking at more growth, a bit more weakness in Q4, and then how does that set us up going into 2024. In segment four, we're going to shift over to Europe. The ECB held the rates constant. We want to look at, are they going to cut soon? Is this also a higher for longer? How is that going to play out? And then in the Asian update, we want to talk a lot about China, how things are being positioned in Q4. September was fairly strong. October has weakened. We've seen some additional stimulus on the fiscal side. How is that going to shape up going forward as well? So as we now turn around and turn this into what is happening in today's world, we first want to stop and look at what's happening in the U.S. So for those that have been following us, we've been talking extensively about food shortages, food issues, and the U.S. is an area that obviously it's the largest economy in the world. We have some of the highest, GDP, especially when you look at the wealthy versus the poor. Even though obviously everyone has their poor. When you look at us on a per capita GDP basis, obviously we're in a good position. So when you look at U.S. food insecurity jumped for the first time in 11 years. More than 17 million families struggled to buy food in 2022. Remember, that's in 2022. That is a year ago in terms of where we are. And if for anybody that goes to the food store, those food prices have not gone down. So on a month-on-month basis, they've continued to go up. So when you look at January of 2023 through October of 2023, every month we've had an increase. So when you look at food insecurity jumping in 2022, do you think it got much better or much worse in 2023? And the reason why we call this to attention is because we're the US. We're the richest country. We're the largest economy. We make enough food. We grow enough food to feed ourselves. And this is the first year in 11 years that we've had an increase. Now, you saw it start to kind of flatline, and this is the issue that we've talked about, and we've seen videos of people complaining about a 9-to-5 job, and I know that those are funny, but you have to take a step back. And again, I didn't watch the video, I just saw the headlines, but you have to take a step back and think about the socioeconomic pressure that people have. It's like, so say for an example, the woman was complaining about 9-to-5. As somebody trying to start my company plus the companies that we've invested in, 9-to-5 is a dream. Like there is no 9-to-5. It's a 24-hour job. I'm answering emails at 3 a.m. I'm reading, news that's coming out because of alerts. And I'm not saying this to say, oh, look, be proud of me. I'm just showing that it takes so much, and yet I'm still struggling. I still struggle to pay Bloomberg, to get the Bloomberg. And again, like I'm sitting here, Bloomberg's super expensive, but I needed to do these shows. I needed to do the investments. Like to do your job and to do things well, the costs are going up. I mean, my healthcare is more expensive than my mortgage. And I have 3 children. I have a wife. I have myself, and that's just co-insurance. Like we still have to pay co-pays and percentages all throughout. So when you look at the pain, no matter it's and again speaking personally, it seems as though no matter how hard you try, you can't break to the next threshold, the next level. And that's because of inflation, because of cost, because of, people are slow paying their bills. I mean, it's nearly impossible to get paid on a timely basis. And then I turn around and because I don't have the money, I can't pay it through. And this is in the US. So just think what that looks like in the developing world, in the emerging markets. And again, like I'm sitting here saying, woe is me, and I'm trying not to. I'm just using this as a standard where, we're at the peak, and if we're struggling, what does the next guy look like? And sometimes it's and this is, again, when you look at that 9 to 5 comment, it's like when you take that stress, which is fair, but then extrapolate it out into other areas where they may not even be able to get food. I mean, I can't imagine not being able to feed my children, but those are real issues that people actually face. Like, this is not like, oh, somebody somewhere. No, I've seen it. I've lived in those areas. I've seen that firsthand. It is gut-wrenching. So to say that we're in a good position globally, and yes, the macro is looking at some things, we break things down to Maslow's hierarchy. And when you look at food as the crux of safety, food safety, water. When you look at that, in order to get to the next level, when you have a crumbling on the food side, that has ramifications that are massive, which is why I wrote that article of what happens post-COVID. There's going to be wars, there's going to be conflicts, because I'm someone who is well off and have the opportunity to try to start multiple businesses and try to create a private equity fund and try to grow companies. What is it for someone that doesn't have that opportunity, but yet is smart and has worked hard and is, tried to do everything right, and they're still feel as though they're left behind? And again, these are things that are going to create uprisings, are going to create problems, and that's what we continue to see. One of the things that, pivoting to one of those problems, when you look at when you look at Israel, when you look at Gaza, you point to the problems. And one of the things that, going back to something that President Bush said prior to moving into Iraq, into Afghanistan, is, we will strike at the time and place of our choosing. And I think it's important to look at, the structure of what's happening. So obviously Israel, Gaza, the Hamas, went into Israel. They've now been running a significant amount of airstrikes. There was an overnight raid from the Israeli side and more of a testing side. But when you look at what has to happen, as we said, the U.S. had to move assets into position. The USS Carney shooting down several missiles, over 15 drones, showed that we have to have assets in place to protect and create. If you think of like a dome, obviously Israel has the Iron Dome, but that doesn't handle bigger missiles. That, what does that mean for drones? So when you start looking at the U.S. carrier group moving in, a lot of these that have the ability to deploy THAAD or THAAD assets on the ground. They can put Patriot missile batteries. And the whole concern was, if Israel moves in, which it will, they and we need to make sure that there is protection based on what Iran does. Iran is attacked. I think we're up to 13 of our, Iran and their proxies, or the proxies in general, have attacked U.S. assets. There's a concern on, okay, well, what do those assets look like? What is going to be the problem going forward? And how are we going to respond? One of the things that we learned back then is, typically a week prior to a rocket attack against a U.S. entity, they will empty the buildings that they normally operate from. Then if the U.S. reacts right away, they hit the buildings are empty, and then things move on. Now, it's good to take a pause and say, and again, not to say that we shouldn't defend our men and women that are serving in the military, because we should, but make it effective. And I think that's the message that needs to be sent is, we know where you are, we know how you're operating, and really point that out and strike that harder, because there's going to be a lot of this to come. When you turn to Russia, Ukraine, which we'll talk more about with pictures tomorrow, Russia continues to push on the offensive. Ukraine has launched a counteroffensive. There's been some progress on the Russian side, some progress on the Ukrainian side, but it's essentially trench warfare. And the amount of lives that are lost to gain these entry points is massive. We've had some desertions from Russia. Russian soldiers. And that's not surprising. I'm sure there's probably, obviously it's all about who you're following. There's probably some similar on the Ukrainian side, most likely less, just because, again, they are defending their homeland, where the people there, or the Russians coming in, are looking around saying, why are we even here? Like, and this is, not that it's gotten to the populace, but that is a running concern, because morale is very low on the Russian side. But the Ukrainians need money, they need equipment. And the question is going to be, or the point is, they don't want these things to connect. So when you look at the conversations that have happened between Biden and MBS, when you look at Saudi Arabia, there has to be some pause on the Saudi Arabia side, because the Hamas are Sunnis. So Shia Iranians, which are Iranian Shia, were able to get the Hamas to do their bidding, or to react in kind, creating this problem with Israel. Now the issue is, is Iran doing something similar within Sunnis within Saudi? Like, there's got to be a little bit of a concern on, what does this look like going forward, and how does Saudi try to position itself? The UAE, we think, has done a very good job of trying to manage this geopolitically, trying to stay fairly neutral. But again, they still maintain their support of Israel. They still maintain their normalized relations. And I think that's going to be important, because as Israel goes in, there's going to be more about how is this going to be impacted. Then you look at Lebanon. The Lebanese PM came to South Lebanon and essentially said, we are going to honor the UN 2006 treaty. This is not us. And it's a way of letting Israel know, you do not need to worry about the Lebanese army. It doesn't mean you don't have to worry about Hezbollah, because that's out of their control. But essentially, don't come into this country. We want none of this. We want to be peaceful. We've seen that with the Lebanese people trying to knock the Hezbollah off their motorcycles and other types of equipment. Like, they set up roadblocks as they tried to get to the border, because the civilians are tired of it. I mean, most of this region is so disgusted with just consistent conflict, consistent wars, which again really ramped up during the Arab Spring. But remember, back to our first comment, or as they said abroad, the wheat wars or the peasant uprising. So again, this is why we talk so much about these issues, because this is going to get worse before it gets better. And this is all going to happen in Q4. And typically that scares people, that slows things down. People back off a bit, and you see a shift in foreign direct investment. And we're going to talk about how Russia has lost foreign direct investment, and anybody who supported Russia has seen a drop, because it's like, wait, guys, like, how are we structuring our supply chain? How is this setting itself up going forward? And these are things we want to talk about. So now when we look at Gaza, you can see in terms of where the densely populated areas are, they're obviously, Israel's trying to strike areas with as best precision as possible within North Gaza, just because when you look at Gaza City, that is where you're going to have a large part of the fighting area, region. That's the area that Israel has told people to or urged to evacuate and move southward. Again, saying it doesn't mean it makes it easier, nor does it mean that Hamas is going to let this happen. So again, when you look at Lebanon, they reaffirmed on Tuesday the commitment to the UN resolution that ended the 2006 conflict between Israel and Hezbollah amid the border tensions. Israel's retaliatory bombing, when you look at what has been done, this is, again, softening the blow in terms of what the Israeli military has to do once they go in. But as we've said before, we've written about it, they are going to go border to coast. And that's going to be a big piece going forward. Now, this is interesting when you look at what happened with the damage sustained across following a vessel. So the Chinese New Polar Bear container vessel it's technically Chinese. Apparently, it has a Russian connection, whether it's owned by or flagged in. But based on the damage that was done, it looks like it was dragging its anchor. Again, was it on purpose, where they knew where some of the infrastructure was, and they dropped it, dragged it, lifted it back up, took it, dropped it, dragged it? Because to drag it for that long and not realize that you're going slower than you should and that you're getting a lot of drag. I mean, there's sensors everywhere if something is amiss. Is it malicious? Who knows? Is it damaging? Yes. This has resulted in some additional protection and surveillance of key infrastructure because this is natural gas pipelines. This is infrastructure that's carrying data, networks. So again, these are very important pieces when you look at what has happened between not only coming from within Europe, but obviously Estonia on up. Now, when we start looking at the PMI output, so more countries fall into contraction and global demand begins to soften as we head into those final months or that Q4. So when you take all of the food problems, you take the geopolitical problems, now you break it down into the economic pieces, well, things are slowing. And this is what we've been talking about. Some areas are slowing more than others. And it all comes down to what does the fiscal spending look like? What was the monetary spending look like? And those are pieces that we want to go through in more detail in the next few segments when you look at a lot of these pressure points. So then when we turn to the cardboard box recession lingers, and that's just looking at shipping, world foreign trade volumes are down. And when you look at that slowdown, it's not that it's going to collapse. And that's what we've talked about when you look at 2008, you look at 2020, you look at some of these pieces, it's the slowdown is going to be persistent and sticky at these negative numbers. And it's not that we're going to go down, that we're down 3.2%. Some estimates have us down 5%. We don't see a collapse down 20%. Maybe it's a quick collapse and then a snapback. Our view is that it's going to stay below that 0% for a lot longer than what people expect. Employment PMIs mostly decline in most major developed markets in October, especially in the manufacturing sector. So again, as employment PMIs decline, well, it means that there's going to be less jobs for people. If there's less jobs, there's going to be more competition for the current jobs, which again then also creates the other problem. When you look at wages and where wages sit. So policy has become less supportive, but not yet restrictive. And this is the other issue as well, because employment is starting to slow. Again, different everywhere. You still have the ability to continue to tighten, to continue to push some of these things in general. So the policy has become less supportive, but not yet restrictive. And that's important because everyone keeps, hemming and hawing that the Fed needs to cut, they're going to be forced to cut. It's like they're going to be forced to do nothing. No one's going to force the Fed because rates were artificially low for a decade, of this foolish ZERP. As we said, going back to 1995, if you said the 10-year was at 5%, people would kind of blink at you and be like, yeah, okay. And yet everyone's like, oh, well, innovation is going to slow down. How much innovation happened between the 60s and 2002 when we started to see a bigger rollout of ZERP? I mean, a lot of really cool, great things happened in that period. So to say that innovation is going to stall is absurd. Instead, it ushered in the massive financial manipulation, buy back stock, leverage balance sheets, cut R&D, play a financial game and not a creation game. And again, these are things that have to be cleared. We have to purge that system of zombie companies, poor allocation of capital, and things of the like. So now when you look at global prices charged in October, it is pushed higher. Again, this is that key leading indicator when you look at inflation, and it just shows you that on a global basis, inflation isn't done. It's not that it's going to surge to 2021 highs. It's that it's not done. And that's, again, back to the very first chart, is going to make things really difficult for everyone. Globally speaking, not just the U.S. Post-pandemic growth cycle nearing its end. Again, that makes sense when you look at consumer confidence slowing, and eventually, depending on where we are, how you look, GDP is going to continue to slow. Shift in term premia and market rate expectations. When you look at it in general, the rate expectations still remain elevated. Turkey just increased its interest rates. We've seen A lot of countries that cut have started to raise them again because of the inflation coming back. Net bank lending to the private sector has slowed, but you can see it's not fully negative. It's negative in some areas, but it's not like this massive slowdown and stop. There's still money being moved, and that's what we try to talk, and we'll talk more about M2 and some of the misconceptions when you look at some of these data points. But it's important that countries that didn't condemn Russia trail foreign direct investment. And this is where it gets interesting, because the world looks beyond China for factories of the future. So when you look at the different pieces voted to condemn Russia, it means that as we get more particular about who we're working with, and especially when you look at a human rights side and who you're aligning with, you're going to see people that no longer have funny money and are just going to blast it everywhere. They want to make sure that it's going to be focused. It's going to be in a spot that makes sense. And geopolitically speaking, you want to make sure there's going to be some stability, because there is a lot of instability out there. So typically a lot of the areas, not all of them, a lot of them that followed and either abstained from condemning Russia are in areas that are not geopolitically safe. So the world looks beyond China for factories of the future. This is what we've been talking about, foreign direct investment in China since the pandemic started compared to the 5 years prior. Nearshoring, onshoring is going to accelerate and going to get much worse. And that's not much worse, but continue down that trend is the better way to say it. But again, this is that Russian benefit, not the Russian benefit, the impact of those that supported Russia and how that's benefited people that didn't support Russia. So when you look at the Middle East, there's you can see the votes to condemn Russia. Africa as well. India is probably the only country that has done exceedingly well because of it. But then when you start looking at ASEAN nations, it's like, well, if I have an option of giving money to Vietnam or Indonesia, where do they stand on human rights? How does this look? And again, these are things that are going to weigh on how people are going to disseminate capital, which is going to be interesting, because this is, again, you can force diplomacy using your policy and your spending habits. And that's something that is going to be an interesting one to watch. Now, when you look at the required investment in gas to meet the future demand, it continues to adjust, but you get an idea that the world needs to invest, according to a Japanese think tank, $7 trillion to ensure gas supply through 2050. The scenario assumes a 56% reduction in emissions by 2050, as emerging nations won't hit net zero by middle of century. But again, the most benefit that has come from reducing carbon, GHG, has been the conversion from coal to natural gas. So we have to find ways to accelerate that. So that's what we have for you on segment 1. In segment 2, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and how things are shaping up from not only just a review of Q3, but how we're positioned into Q4.